Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another pattern drafting demonstration. And today's lesson really does build upon everything I talked about in the darts video. So I know this video is long, but it's very comprehensive on my, explanation of how darts work, why we use darts, what dart fullness even is, and how it helps to fit the bodice. So do give this video a watch first before this one if you haven't seen it, just because I think it'll clear up a lot of questions as we start moving into slightly more complex things today. It's just a kind of jumping off point from that earlier video showing how to use dart fullness as gathering to create different styles. And today I have 4 vintage fashion inspired styles or modifications to make to your bodice block using dart fullness as gathering. So I've grabbed some 1940s patterns from the internet to go ahead and show you how to replicate different elements of those styles. And then I'll finish up today with a final design where we combine 2 of the earlier techniques into one asymmetric design. Let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. And today I'll be starting with tracings of my regular bodice block, my 2-dart bodice front here. Of course, if your darts are in a different place, you can always move them to be like this if you want to. Basically, the amount of dart fullness I have for my size, my personal body shape, is just split into these 2 darts, one at the waist and one on the side. But let's go ahead and move all that dart fullness up into the shoulder for our first design today. Here's a little 1940s pattern that uses shoulder gathering to fit this bodice. Looks like they've left a little bit of the fullness at the waist as well, and you can always use some of your dart fullness in one spot and leave the rest in another place. Just like I have 2 darts on this bodice, we could have 2 areas of gathering as well. But now that I've drawn in where I want my dart fullness to go, those lines up from the apex into the shoulder, I can go ahead and cut up to the apex from these 2 darts. Again, we could use 1 dart of fullness up here or both. So I will go ahead and close both of these original darts here and open them up into the shoulder. You can fill this in with paper, sew these as darts or tucks up here, or you can just use this amount of fullness to create gathering up in the shoulder like our little image shows. So I'll go ahead and fill this in here, because we're going to need to cut our fabric out into this strange new shape we've created, like so. Now, my personal shape, I have quite a difference ratio between my bust and waist measurement. So my waist measurement is around 31, my bust is around 41, 42. These things fluctuate throughout the month what exact size I am, but my ratio between my waist and my bust is around 10 inches at any time, which means I have plenty of dart fullness to work with. Sometimes if you have less dart fullness, it will create less gathering. This is something that you can, however, change. So we'll be talking about adding additional fullness and flare in when your dart fullness is not enough for the style you desire. But if we gather this shoulder down, we will create, again, this style. So this is gathered shoulder, 2023. This center front here will still be cut on the fold. No problem there. Just smooth off any extra bits of paper and tape down some floops on the back if I have to, so things don't get stuck on anything. But I will go ahead and show you what that would look like if you had smaller dart fullness as well. Because for this, it's all flared up here into the shoulder, and I have quite a lot to work with up here, right? Again, this is plenty of flare, but I could add even more flare up here. If you had a very thin fabric, if you're working with a very thin silk that you could really pack in the gathering if you would like to, just for style reasons, you can. So I have, again, 10 inches of difference between my bust and my waist. Let's take off a good 5/8 from each dart. Let's imagine that my dart legs are where these red markings are as opposed to the original purple. So let's say I have smaller darts. It's the same size, it's just my waist and my bust have a smaller ratio difference. So it'll open up into the shoulder, same thing we just did, closing these darts, opening them up into the shoulder area. Again, I didn't, choose very carefully exactly where these are in the shoulder, by the way, because it's all going to be rounded off for gathering anyway. But if you were doing darts up into the shoulder and actually sewing them as darts, you could, measure them, make sure they're 1 inch apart or whatever you wanted to do. You can have them closer to the shoulder tip or closer to the neckline. Doesn't matter. You can split it into 2. You can split it into 5 tiny darts if you want to. But with smaller dart fullness, you can see the flare in the shoulder here is a little bit less. The thicker the fabric, the less you can gather and the less gathering will be seen. So you have to add more for it to show up. But at the same time, the more you add, the bulkier it's going to get in a thicker, like coating weight wool or something. So again, if you have more gathering or want more gathering in a style, go for something that is a thinner fabric, a cotton poplin or voile or a silk or rayon. So if I lay my pattern on top of this, you can see how much wider my shoulder is just because my darts are larger. The amount of pinch out I need to fit my body between my ratio, my bust and hip, is larger. So on a pattern like this, for someone who has a smaller dart fullness, I might go ahead and draw lines down into the waist at an angle through the shoulder like this, and then use these not as darts, but as just wedges of fullness. So we're now flaring this pattern not for fit reasons, but just for style reasons. We already flared as much as we can from the darts up into the shoulder, but we can add additional flare here to add in more gathers just because for the fun of it. Our fit is done using the dart fullness, but we can add additional style and additional flare fullness up into the shoulder to be almost the same as my pattern that would fit me, just by taping in extra wedges like so. So I would tape in more paper, spread that out as much as you want. Again, the wider you make it, the more gathering you will need to do to fit it down to the back shoulder, and therefore the thinner your fabric would need to be to make that possible. Because if you've ever tried to gather with very thick fabric, you'll notice it's not the most fun thing ever. But I went ahead and cut out my first version there, the one that fits me with my regular dart fullness, out of some cotton muslin here. I'm just marking about an inch in from either side, the neckline and the arm side, to go ahead and gather these shoulders down. You can measure your original pattern to know how much you need to gather this down to, or of course it needs to fit into the back, and unless you're also gathering the back will still be the same shoulder size, so you can fit this down and fit it into the shoulder. I'll show you that in a moment, but this is all going to get gathered down so we can fit our bodice. Over here on my machine, I'm just going to start where I had left myself a pin using the largest stitch setting on my machine. This is like 7 stitches per inch, I think is the largest size on this 99K. I'm going to do 2 lines, parallel lines of stitching that are within the 1/2 inch seam allowance here. These are about a little over 1/8 of an inch away from one another. That's just using the edge of my presser foot as a guide to do those parallel lines of stitching, not actually measuring anything, because I tend not to measure or do much math in my sewing. As much pattern drafting and manipulation as I do, again, it's never actual. I never really get out the pencil and paper and do any math, you'll notice. So even measuring, I'm winging it half the time. And I can bring that over onto my ironing board here, and I'm just going to tie off my gathering threads closest to the neckline. You can do it on the other side as well, whatever you like. I bring all my threads to the top of the fabric to do that, and then I will grab the 2 top threads from this side and start gathering my very large widened shoulder down. So this is just dart fullness on this one. Again, you can add additional fullness, but for me, because I usually have enough with my dart fullness when I'm doing a style like this, I usually just keep it to fit fullness as opposed to style fullness. And again, now that I have that gathered down, I can match it up with the length of my regular shoulder here on my back pattern piece. So I'll sew my shoulder seams and make sure this is gathered down to the correct size and space out my gathers so they're not too bunched up in one area. So I like to kind of space those out so this extra fabric can be distributed as evenly as possible. But I have gotten many questions before about doing gathered styles, especially the next style I'll show you, because I have made a video making a dress with the next style about how to add in more gathering if your dart fullness does not provide you with enough. And it usually is possible. Sometimes with really particular cutting, it may not be possible, but usually for simple things like everything I'm covering today, you can definitely add in more gathering just for style reasons. But I'll go ahead and sew those shoulders down, sew my side seams as well, of course. That way I can try this muslin on for you and show you what this modification looks like. And I have switched back over to my 12 stitches per inch, a smaller stitch length, for more security over here on the machine. And of course I will be doing back stitching here as opposed to when I was doing the gathering stitching. You don't need to start and stop with back stitches for that, because you want the thread to be able to move, as opposed to when you're actually sewing things together, you want the thread to stay. Just a sewing note to keep in mind. But here is this muslin on my body over a very cheap camisole and my wool pencil skirt here. But I have the gathering all up into the shoulder. Again, that kind of comes, like, radiates from the bust up into the shoulder, of course, because the bust is where the dart fullness radiates from on the front of a bodice like this one. And so this is what this looks like. It's smooth from the bust down. All, you know, the underarm, the waist area, all of that has nothing going on. It's just smooth fabric. And all the fit is done with the gathering up into the shoulders, just as if, you know, there were darts there. Instead of darts, we've just used that fullness as gathering instead. And for our next style, let's go ahead and put the gathering up into the neckline. Again, I'm going to separate that into 2 spots here, just along the neckline. You can put one of these darts directly into the center front too if you want to. And we're going to make a style like this little one from the 1940s here. Now again, you have seen me do this before if you've watched all of my videos, in which case, thank you, because I used this exact style to make the bug print poplin dress a couple of years ago. I can put a card up to that, but I will also be showing you that dress here in a moment as well. Again, I will cut through my dart legs to my apex for both the area where I want the darts to be and where the darts originally were. Close my original darts, tape those closed, cut off the extra paper if I have it in my way, and then again, I can fill in the new areas of darts, basically. Again, we can split this evenly, and again, you could use this as darts or tucks up here in the neckline, but I will, of course, be using it for gathering today to create this style like we see here. Now, this little gal here with her funny pom-poms of feathers or bows or something on the side of her head, it's an interesting look. she has the all-in-one sleeve. So you could start with your all-in-one sleeve bodice block and do the same style, which is how I made the bug print dress that you'll see in a moment. But all this gathers down. We still create the cone of our bust here. My dart fullness is all up into my neckline now. So again, we have the same fit achieved, just slightly modifying the style so that the gathering is at the neckline instead of the shoulder. Again, you could flare this out additionally and add in more gathering here at the neckline if your darts were not giving you enough for the style you desired. Again, you just want to flare some lines down from where you want the fullness to the waist. And we can flare this open some more, like so. So I could add a bunch more gathering in here if I wanted to. And this dress here from, I believe this is from the 1950s, shows what a lot more gathering up into the neckline would look like. This is a soft jersey fabric that they're using here, and that's why they can pack so much gathering into the neckline. And you can see this is additional gathering. You can even see the pull lines are going from below the waist up into that neckline, so it's definitely additional gathering beyond just dart fullness for that design. But today I'll just use my fit fullness as opposed to anything additional, once again. Just my personal preference for my particular shape and wardrobe, and the fabrics I tend to like to use. If I used thinner fabrics more often, perhaps I would add additional fullness, but I don't like to work with very floopy thin fabrics, as we know. I really have to work up to that kind of thing, and somehow build up courage to work with flimsy rayons and silks. But again, I have cut this piece along the center front on the fold of some muslin here. Again, I will mark where my gathering needs to be, about 1 inch in from either side of the neckline, and I need to gather this down to fit what the original neckline measurement was. So if you grab your original pattern that you start with, measure the neckline. Mine's going to be 4.5 inches. That's 4.5 inches for either side, so 9 inches total for this neckline. So when I put my gathering stitching in here and pull everything down, it needs to fit to be 9 inches long. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, if you've seen the other dressmaking video, then you've seen all this before. Again, I will use 2 parallel lines of gathering stitching. Again, the largest stitch length on my machine here. You could gather things by hand too if you wanted to, of course. I have no problem doing it by machine. Some people hate gathering. It's never given me any trouble. For this one, I'm going to mark the center front on this so I don't get lost, because I know each side of this needs to be 4.5. So that'll help me distribute my gathers evenly once again. So I'll gather that down pretty far, and then I can stretch this out if I need to fit that 9 inches. And just give that a quick measure, make sure I'm on track. And then I will tie off my gathering threads just because, obviously, for the muslin mock-up of this today, I'm not going to be sewing on a facing or a bias tape to finish this or anything. I usually like to finish this style of neckline by bias binding the edge of the neckline. I just find that looks nice and finished and holds all this gathering in place, of course. But you could finish this with a facing or a lining as well. Just make sure I have that all measured before I tie these off. And of course, you know, I'm just going to be leaving it like this, unfinished, but you wouldn't want to leave anything like just with the tied gathering threads, because if they snapped, the style would come apart. But for now, I can go ahead and sew my shoulder seams again, put some more backs on here. So I actually did make, this last week, 7 sets of muslin backs. So this is just my standard bodice block back that I'm using for all of these. So I sewed a lot of back darts and had quite the assembly line going for making all these muslins to show you what these styles look like. Normally I would have recycled the backs, but I had a lot to get done in a small, weird amount of time before I left for London, so. But here is what that style looks like. Again, here's another pattern from the 1940s or 50s. I'm not exactly sure. It's a cuspy pattern where there is gathering up into the neckline. It looks like they left the other, like they used maybe the side dart, and then they left the waist dart open to have like more of a blousey fit around the waist. But for me, I have all my gathering up into my neckline here, and that's what this looks like. Again, if you would like to see the all-in-one sleeve version of this, I do have a video covering that entirely as well. It's one of my older videos too, so I don't know if I have top-down camera on that one. I'm not sure. But here's what that dress looks like. So again, here's my version of the dress in the top left corner here. But this is a style I use actually quite often. I really like it with the all-in-one sleeve. It's a great, simple summer dress to throw an A-line skirt on this and you're ready to go. And for our next style, let's go ahead and move the dart fullness into the center front. That's right. Why not? Now, a style like this one obviously has a V neck, so the dart fullness is distributed not over this, like not as high as I'm about to go with these today, but I've drawn 4 darts into the center front from the apex to close my 2 darts here into. So I'm going to distribute my fullness along the center front here. Now, these darts have less distance to travel and therefore have to open up less, so I'm getting less for my money here. Because when you throw a dart up into the shoulder, there's more distance to cover, so the angle flares more. This is where geometry starts to come into it. Hopefully you can kind of understand what I mean by watching all this, by watching the darts video. It's not that the dart fullness angle changes. The ratio is the same. It's just the end of the triangle is a different size because it's covering less distance. Oof, this really does. If any of you are math people who understand exactly what I'm talking about, go ahead and give it an explain for everyone else in the comments below, because I can barely teach pattern drafting, let alone teach math, but this is where geometry is coming into play. I have taped my original darts closed. I am now taping down excess paper into where I have splayed it along the front here, just kind of evenly spacing that between the 4 darts I drew in, cutting off my extra paper, and then cutting along this. Now the center front, you'll notice we can no longer cut it on the fold, because I don't know if you have noticed, it's a bit curvy now. It's not going to fit on the straight line. So we're going to need to add seam allowance on here and have a left and a right side. Now I have shown how to do this modification before in a dressmaking video here on the channel as well. I did a very similar modification and just kept the gathering right between the bust line, which is something else you see quite often. In this little pink dress here, they've distributed it from the tip of the v-neck to the waist, but you often see the gathering concentrated right between the bust. And I used that for my orange and black lace spiderweb dress that I made last Halloween. But I'll just go ahead and add on my 1/2 inch of seam allowance here, gathered, center. All this is going to be gathered down to fit, again, the original measurement of my bodice. So I can measure what my original bodice length was, and that's what I need to gather this down into. Again, you can flare this. This time we're going to flare into the side seam. So if you wanted additional fullness along this, you could draw lines radiating out from where we want fullness to a different spot here. It's really kind of like where you want, if you have any lines that end up radiating, where you want those lines to be from. So if you want these lines to kind of pull and radiate from the waist, you could do that. I think the most natural place for this center front gathering is into the side seam like this. But again, I'm going to close this back up because I don't need additional fullness. I mean, with this one, you really could get away with it. Even me. I think if I made a dress with entire center front gathering like this, I would add additional fullness in. But I just want to show you again what this looks like just with dart fullness. So again, I will mark where I need to gather to and from, coming about 2 inches out from the ends here this time, so I can gather these down and show you what this will look like in a garment. Once again, I sewed in 2 parallel lines of gathering stitching along those edges, and I need to tie off one end of this. This time we'll choose down here by the waist and gather these down to again fit the measurement, the original center front measurement of my bodice here, which is 8.5 to 9 inches, kind of depending if I've lowered my neckline a little or not. Of course, the neckline on my bodice block is as tight as possible. So it's like on the verge of being uncomfortable is where I leave my bodice block. But if I were to make a high-necked thing, I would usually lower it at least 1/4 to a 1/2 inch, just so that it's a little bit more comfortable to, you know, breathe and talk and walk and eat in. Because a very tight neckline, a very small neckline, can be fun for style reasons, but it's not the most comfortable thing to wear ever. Not that that usually bothers me, because I'm one who will certainly suffer for fashion. Not a problem. But here I've gathered this too much because I'm expecting to need to gather more. But again, the dart fullness end of the triangles at the center front, it had less distance to travel. I have less gathering necessary. So I would, again, really recommend with this style, if you want more gathering down that center front, to go ahead and flare a little bit from the side seam. But once I have this scrunched down to the correct measurement, I will go ahead and tie off my gathering threads on this end as well. That way I can move the gathering around while those threads stay the exact same measurement. So I can move the gathering here and distribute it evenly across the center front zone of this. And you can already start to see how this is creating the cone and the bust on this side of the pattern. So you can see the bust will fit in here. And I'll do the same to the other side so I can pin these two together down the center front. And you can also see here how this begins quite curved from where we did the pattern manipulation, but once you gather it down, you have rather a straight line to line up with the other side. And once I have that pinned together, I can again take that back over here on the machine, and again, not gathering stitching anymore. I'm using my regular stitch length and my 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual to go ahead and stitch left and right together down the center front. And once that is sewn, I can flip this open over here and give this a bit of a press. Again, you'd want to figure out how to finish your raw edges in here, either from serging them, binding them, pinking shears even at the least, least you can do, or lining this garment. to have that be finished along the center front, especially if you have any sensory problems with fabric, because that will like rub against the center front of your body, and that would be irritating if you were irritated by that kind of thing. Once again, these things do not bother me. It has to be a very scratchy fabric for me to have problems. Although I have been quite good lately about lining things. So I've been fully lining things more and more because I'm trying to make clothes that can be, you know, the future's vintage. Things that someone else can wear again in the future after I'm done with them. So I'm trying to make things nicer these days. Ugh, it takes so much time, but probably worth it. But with my center front together, I can go ahead and again sew my shoulders and side seams and put some backs on here so that I again can try this on for you. And here's what that one looks like. This one does draw quite a lot of attention to the bust, although I of course wear a pointier 1940s style bra, and that's part of what's making this extra conical here. I think it looks better once you have a V-neck or a sweetheart neckline going on and have lowered this neckline. I haven't seen it used with a higher neck like this very often, but I think they did do it pretty often in the 30s as opposed to the 40s. But here is what this mock-up looks like, and here is what my spiderweb dress looks like. So again, this is the same technique, just concentrating all that fullness right here at the center front between the busts. And of course, I have a V-neckline on this one, so you can go ahead and watch this dressmaking video as well if you'd like to see this technique applied for this bodice. And for our final simple gathered style today, I'm going to go ahead and put all of our dart fullness into the side. So one of our darts is already here. Check mark, that one's already in the right spot. Let's close this waist dart into the side as well to create a style like this one where all of the gathering is in the side. This again is used quite often in the 1940s, and I have used it to make a dress before over on Patreon. It's one of my favorite dresses actually. It has a very strong sleeve and can be made to look 80s very easily, so you'll see that in a moment. But again, I've closed my waist dart, opened it up into the side in that new spot, but instead of using these as darts, I'm going to curve this off, I will use this as gathering along the side, like so. Now I don't need to add seam allowance to this curve because while my center front is normally cut in the fold and doesn't have seam allowance, my side already has seam allowance built in, so we're good to go there. And I can go ahead and cut this out of muslin as well. And I can still cut this one on the fold because nothing has happened to our straight center front here. Again, you could add more fullness here, radiating from the center front like so. So you could again draw in lines to go ahead and radiate this out further. Like so, if you wanted to, add additional gathering along the side. This one, again, is not a ton of gathering with just my dart fullness, but it's kind of nice. It almost makes the fitting of it all disappear. And I have heard from folks before saying that they don't have a ton of dart fullness and they can actually just ease in that extra inch or two along the side seam by using like a loosely woven fabric, and you can hardly even tell that it's gathered. So good for you if you can make it work and make it look smooth. But my ratio will not allow this. There's going to be gathering or a dart somewhere. Once again, I'm going to gather those sides down with 2 lines of gathering stitching. It's repetitive because we're doing the same thing over and over again. It's one simple technique, but here's 4 ways to do it. Hopefully you have grasped the initial concept that I'm trying to convey to you today. I really want everyone else to be able to analyze 1940s styles and see what's happening the way that I do. That way, once you fall in love with a design that you see from the past or from now, from any time, you can go ahead and recreate it using your own personal block that already fits you. There's no need to purchase a new pattern every time you want to make a new style, especially since your block will already fit you. So like all of these, you notice I didn't make a mock-up for these mock-ups. I just know that they will fit because I'm starting with the same amount of dart fullness, the same pattern every time, although we are modifying where that fullness is controlled and how it's controlled with gathering instead of darts. Everything still fits me the same sort of way, which is a little bit small right now, but forgive me for that one. Again, I'm tying off one side of my gathering threads, pulling the other 2 down so that I can scooch my fabric down to the correct size. Again, we could measure the side seam, or we can just use the back as a guide here to make sure we have the right size and distribute the gathers evenly for each side. And then I will sew my side seams here and my shoulder seams once again so that I can try this style on for you. And here is this one on. I'm like trying to raise my arms so I can show you what this looks like under here. But yes, there's gathering into the sides. You can see the shoulder and the neckline area, the center front of the waist, everything else is smooth, and then all the gathering is concentrated along the side seams here. This is a dress where I used this. Now this one has an all-in-one sleeve, but there is gathering along my side seams here. And in a jacquard like this, it's almost hardly noticeable, just looks a little bit like fold lines, which falls in with the fold lines of the all-in-one sleeve anyhow, so kind of just looks drapey. And that dress has shoulder pads hidden in it too, of course. And for my final demonstration today, I wanted to use 2 of these earlier ideas of where to put gathering and combine them into one asymmetric bodice. So I have a full front here traced along the center front line, mirrored my pattern along the center front line, so that I can put the gathering on one side into the shoulder and on the other side into the side seam. So let's go ahead and create something asymmetric. We all know I like to do an asymmetric design. So let me close my waist dart on this side and open it back up into the side, just like we just did for our last design, like so. And again, we don't need this little bit for the dart. Goodbye. So now we have a nice smooth line to gather down, like so. My floops are already causing trouble, so let me cut away the excess paper and tape this down before it frustrates me any further. All right, so we have transformed to this side, the right-hand side here, to have the gathering along the side seam. On this side, I'm just going to measure how long that needs to gather down to, so I can write it over here. 8 5/8, which is what my side seam without the dart needs to measure. And then over here, I have a 5.5-inch shoulder, which is what this side will need to gather down to. So if you didn't have backs that were going to perfectly line up, you know, once again, as soon as I start matching this up to the side seam of the back and the shoulder seam of the back, we will know how it needs to fit in there. Yeah. But on this side, I will go ahead and close my waist and side dart up into the shoulder, because we'll do just shoulder gathering on this side. So we have 2 of our earlier modifications on one garment. Again, I need to fill all of this in with some more paper. You get the biggest triangles. The angle, my original angle of dartfulness will give me the biggest triangles up into the shoulder like this, because it has the largest distance across my body to travel to get up to the shoulder from my apex. Hopefully that makes sense. The shorter waisted you are, the truer this will be. Again, smooth this off, like so. So this needs to gather down into 5.5, like so. So this will gather, this will gather. Now, if you wanted to add additional fullness to this design, how would we do it? Because we can't flare this from the center front, and we can flare this one, but the side gathering is kind of hard to expand. So if I wanted to add additional gathering to this, what I would do is draw a line from where we want the fullness, up in the shoulder, down to where we want the fullness, into the side, and just add 2 or 3 inches in the middle here. So I would just draw a diagonal line from that large shoulder on the left into the side seam on the right, and add in lanes of fullness, separating the whole entire pattern and spreading it out. But again, I will make you a mock-up just with my dart fullness here. But it's always good to think about how you could add additional fullness if you wanted to, because I do get that question. So it's possible. It's just you have to kind of think a little bit outside the box. And I'll be showing you a design that primarily relies upon additional fullness as opposed to dart fullness next week. But let me again put my gathering in here so we can get started sewing up this final mock-up for today. I had to switch over to a different color of bobbin thread. I was using up all my leftover bobbins that had thread for projects past. Making mock-ups is a good time to use up extra threads that you won't use often. Like if you bought like a bright purple thread for a project and you're not likely to use it again, use that thread for mock-ups. Especially for me, because it shows up contrasty here on camera, so you can actually see my threads a little bit, which is nice. But I'll gather my shoulder down. Again, I just need to fit it into the back. So I know it needs to be 5.5 inches, but more importantly, I know it just needs to fit into the back shoulder here. So distribute my gathers, pin that together, like so. And I'll do the same for my side over here. Scooching my gathering along to where I need it. And again, I just need to gather this down so that it fits into the side seam of my back, like so. And you can do all of these things with the back dart as well, if you wanted to, by the way. It just, you don't have an apex on the back. It's just like the largest point, like the roundest part of the back is what you're kind of radiating from in the back. So it's a little different. There's much more dart fullness to work with on the front usually for the bust. But you can do these same things on the back if you would like to. And on the skirt for that matter. But here's this final design today. I have gathering up into the shoulder and some gathering at the side seam. Here's a similar design I found from the 40s where she has a little bit more going on, but the general idea of having gathering in the shoulder and in the side is the same. And honestly, it's a very cute blouse, and maybe I should make one sometime. I hope you enjoyed these demos today and found them illustrative of how you can use dart fullness to create gathering in your styles, and how you can add additional fullness when that gathering is not enough, I suppose, when the amount of dart fullness that you have in your own personal size of bodice block isn't going to provide you enough gathering for the style you have in mind. You can always add more. You just have to kind of analyze exactly where you need to add those flare lines into, because you can always add more gathering in. And thank you so much as always for watching today. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.